I see the same 15-ish mistakes being made over and over again. And I should really know because I used to make all of them myself back when I was starting out. I'm a full-time working nature photographer. And I'm also a full-time working nature photography teacher. Over the last 7 years, I have taught approximately 50 photography workshops out in nature, out around the entire world. In this video, I'm now going to go through 5 of the top mistakes that I see over and over again. Let's look at this image right here. I took this image about 7-8 years ago in France. It is shot at 200mm full frame. It's shot using a tripod at f8 and 1/15 of a second. What's wrong with this image? Zooming in here, you can see that this image is soft, unusably soft. I used to believe that as long as I was on a good quality tripod, I could shoot at a focal length of 200mm at almost any shutter speed. I also used to believe that I had to be shooting at base ISO to maximize image quality, and that I had to be at f8 to f11 or so on a full frame lens. These days when I'm out shooting, I shoot at whatever ISO gets me to the shutter speed and the aperture that I want. And I change my aperture based on my subject matter and the depth of field that I need in the particular image. But beyond that, I now know that a tripod is not a golden solution to good image quality. I know that it's quite often detrimental to image quality because it gives you a false belief that you can shoot at slow shutter speeds with long lenses, and this is simply not true. My golden rule these days is that I should be at least at half the focal length in shutter speed. So if I'm shooting at 200mm like here, I should have been at 1/100 of a second. This is a mistake that I see from about 75% of my workshop participants. They fear going at anything except base ISO. And I used to have the same fear myself. Today I have no problem shooting up to about 1000 ISO for landscapes, and I don't even worry about the noise levels. So to summarize the first one, how do you fix it? Well, first of all, sturdy tripod. My static scenes, I shoot them all from a sturdy tripod. I don't care what the ISO will be. If it's ISO 800, no problem. If that's what I need, that's what I get. I do half my focal length as my minimum shutter speed when I'm on the tripod. That generally over 4 pictures, at least one of them will be tack sharp, and that's what I want. I'm not afraid of changing my aperture up or down if I need to based on the scene in front of me. And that's it really. Like the previous mistakes, this is something that I see a lot of photographers do, myself often included. We arrive at the scene, we shoot it, and then we go. You know, this sounds like the way you do landscape photography, but I see 2 huge risks with doing it like this. First of all, you might not love the shot that you got. The composition might be just a little bit off. And second, your focus might have been just a little bit off. Take for example this photograph. This here is the Trecime in the Italian Dolomites. I came here specifically to photograph this mountain. But the problem was that the sky was just too boring. The light was too flat. At least in the direction of the Trecime. One always has to be adaptable, and one always has to shoot the seconds. In this case, I didn't shoot the seconds of the Trecime. Instead, I turned 90 degrees to my left and photographed an absolutely incredible cloud inversion. Mountain peaks sticking up through the clouds, greeted by a beautiful pink and light blue, almost silvery sky. Had I only been focusing on the Trecime, only focusing on my primary subject matter and not at all shooting my seconds, well, I think I would have gone home empty-handed. Instead, I went home with images that I personally absolutely love. Shooting the seconds can take many different shapes and forms. In this example, I was out in the northwest of Svalbard photographing the polar bear Portia. photographing her with my long lens was indeed the shot that I had been dreaming about. But as she started moving off into the distance, I got a chance to photograph other images of other polar bears. For example, this image, 2 images of polar bears surrounded by the natural environment, more like environmental portraits, if you like. And for me, sitting here looking at these images, there is no doubt about which image it is that I personally prefer. It is definitely my seconds. These images for me are just so much more powerful. You know, you might come home with an image that you don't love because the composition is wrong. Well, get a second angle. Move away from your first spot and do it again, but slightly differently. Get a second focal length in there. Maybe you shot the first image wide, well, go really long. Or if you went already long, go really wide. And the third thing, get it in focus. Always do a second shot where you've reconfirmed your focus point. The third mistake that I see over and over again is the following. I see countless photographers arriving at the location and start wandering around looking for the perfect shot. The problem with this is that it takes a ridiculous amount of time. I've seen on workshops so many of my guests miss the best light of the day just because they couldn't find anything to photograph. I can arrive at a scene and get 3, 4, 5 images into my camera before most of my participants have even unpacked their tripods. And I do this because I have to. I want to get the images in. I want to understand the light and the scene so that I can teach how to capture the scene in the best possible scenario. And then I can start explaining the scene to those participants who wants that information. But also I can start exploring the scene together with the workshop participant looking for the smart images. I'm going to give you an example. Here we had a super busy, complicated foreground, but I was so obsessed chasing these smart scenes that I didn't wait for the light to be perfect. Another image shot maybe 100 meters or so from the first one. A super complicated image, super busy, complicated foreground. Sure, this image I don't hate as much as the previous one, but in my view, it's still a very challenged image. A third image shot about 100 meters from the first one. Here we have even more stuff going on with all the reds contrasting against the rocks, the waters, and all the blues in the image. And now we're gonna go to a fourth image shot about 50 meters from all of the other images. And look at this panorama. This is the simple shot. This is a long lens panorama of the scene that unfolds across the water from all of the other images that you saw. Simple always beats smart. Simple means that you can bag your first 5 images before any one of your pals has even gotten the camera out of their bags. Simple means that you shoot the obvious scenes that are easy to understand, easy to digest. Simple also means that you can get more shots done. This next one is a big one, so important for all photographers to know. Let's look at 2 images. First this one, and now this one. Let's go back to the first one. How do you feel the mountain in this image? Is it huge, big, great, imposing, dramatic? And let's ask the same question for this second image again. Huge, big, great, imposing, dramatic, whatever I said. Which of these mountains do you feel is bigger? As you can see, I've cropped this image incredibly tight here in the first image again, and I've given it a lot more space here in the second image. Now, this is what we call negative space. Negative space is space that is, let's call it, unused, and it surrounds your subject matter. My subject matter in this image is quite obviously the mountain. And by including all this negative space around my subject matter, I give this mountain what I like to call breathing room. The mountain looks bigger when you have a lot of breathing room. A lot of photographers will go in tight because they've heard so many other photographers say, zoom with your feet, get closer to it. Only include that which is most important. But this is the worst advice you could ever get. When it comes to landscapes, the negative space is quite often what makes an image great. I'm going to give you some example here of negative space. With this image, look good without this incredibly beautiful but empty sky. Continuing onwards, this is an image from my recent visit to Svalbard. I've given these cabins an enormous amount of negative space above. But how does that space then help these cabins? For me, it makes these cabins feel more isolated, more lonely, more far away from society and civilization. Or look at this image here of this beautiful polar bear walking in the snow. Why have I included all this white stuff around her? Why not just focus in on the polar bear itself and get those dramatic expressions? Well, for me as a conservation photographer, I want to talk about the loneliness of this polar bear. I want her to feel fragile. I want her to stand out in this stark, hostile landscape where global warming is impacting. Another example where there's a great amount of negative space, a huge sky above the mountains. For me, negative space is something that I love to explore. I think it's perhaps the most interesting composition element there is. And I love to shoot with a lot of negative space. And I think it works really well in a certain type of images. But as I said, this is actually a mistake that a lot of people do. They shoot too tight. And the solution is so simple. Get a couple of more shots. If you want a tight shot, get it. But then zoom out a little bit. Move backwards, change your lens, whatever. Get more of that sky into your image, and I guarantee you will have a lot more interesting results. This next mistake, I think, is going to cause a little bit of a storm of comments and disagreement with me here in the comment sections. How do you learn photography? Let's consider what variables are available to us as landscape photographers. First of all, we have our perspective. We can change from where we take a specific image. We can change our focal length. Instead of shooting something at 50mm, I can go a lot closer and shoot at 20. The next one is framing, right? So we can frame things in camera with our little 2x3 or 4x3 or whatever. We can also choose where we put our focus point. Not all images needs to be tack sharp throughout the entire image. Some images we might actually want to be blurry in the foreground and in the background and only have a certain part of the image in focus. Then we have time of day, time of year, season. And then we have the three perhaps most important things that we can change: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, the exposure triangle. These things we can change. But we can only change these three things if we're shooting in manual. And I get so many of my guests on my workshops not shooting manual. And I think that's the biggest mistake you can make when you're learning photography. Because if you let your camera decide your settings for you, you are no longer perhaps accountable for those settings. You will be like, okay, I shot this scene at 1/15th of a second and the leaves in the trees are moving. Well, you know that you selected that shutter speed and you know that you will now have to learn from that mistake. And next time you're shooting, let's say, a woodland scene where the leaves are moving, you will be at 1/100th of a second instead. I'm not suggesting that anyone should shoot in manual in every scenario, because in wildlife, I don't even shoot in manual. In portraits, I don't shoot in full manual most of the time. Okay, because I'm reacting to a subject matter that is incredibly fast, and when the subject matter is fast, the camera is faster at making decisions than I am. But when it comes to static subjects like landscapes, I don't need the camera to be fast. I need myself to learn and to be accurate. The more decisions we make as photographers, the better the result will be, because the more we will learn from our mistakes. To tell you the real truth, the mistakes I have told you about today actually count for number 2 to number 6. The reason I didn't mention the number 1 mistakes that people make on a photography workshop is that in itself is an entire video to explain. And that mistake is not fully understanding exposure, bit depth, and image quality. It is a challenging topic, but it is very manageable for anyone who is nerdy enough like me to really dive deep and understand, and how we can use how a sensor works to our advantage to maximize image quality in every single image. But it's a huge topic. I cannot teach that today, so we're saving that for another video. Now that you know what some of the absolutely biggest mistakes that I see a lot of photographers make, why don't you go and have a look at this video instead, where I discuss themes of style versus mission. If you're instead in the mood of watching something more interview type, well, here's a half-an-hour interview with myself and Thomas Heaton. That's all for me for now. Thanks, guys.